This story is not a saga of kings, queens, or heroic deeds. This is the story of the silent cries of millions of people which still echo in every wave of the Atlantic. It is the tale where humanity forgot its own nature and invented the perfect method for turning a person into mere property. This history gave birth to the American nation, whose Declaration of Independence was written upon the labor of enslaved people. 1. The Middle Passage, the lightless path. The source of the darkness lay far away in West Africa on an unknown day in the 16th century. Imagine a farmer, perhaps busy in his rice fields or with his fishing nets. Suddenly, his familiar life shattered. He was sold because European merchants demanded labor that came at no cost, to cultivate tobacco, and sugar in their new colonies. He was forcibly marched to those fortresses on the coast, which were the first prisons built for human beings. The air here was heavy with the smell of death, and the roar of the ocean was the last symbol of hope for freedom. Hundreds of people waited, packed together, each mind plagued by one question: where are we going? Why are we going? This waiting ended when the slave ships arrived at the port, those vessels known in history as the slavers. The terrifying voyage. The scene inside the ship was a moving hell. Men, women, and children were laid out on the wooden planks, one on top of the other. Their hands and feet were shackled tightly. No light entered, no air circulated. Every corner of this dark hold bore the stains of vomit, excrement, and blood. The spread of disease was inevitable: dysentery, smallpox, which were the messengers of death. Approximately 2 million people died on this route. Their bodies merged with the waves, and the Atlantic became a vast mass grave. This journey is known as the Middle Passage. Those who chose death by jumping into the ocean were perhaps among the lucky ones, because the perpetual darkness of slavery would no longer await them. But those who survived faced an even harder ordeal: the humiliation and the life of enslavement in the New World. 2. Jamestown's wrong turn, from human to property. When the first Africans set foot in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, their status was somewhat gray. They were indentured servants, but their circumstances were subtly different from European servants. However, as the demand for tobacco skyrocketed, the greed of the owners began to overwhelm them. They realized that labor whose term never expired was the most profitable. Thus, colonial society made a terrible decision: to make slavery hereditary and permanent. The iron hand of the law. In 1662, Virginia passed a catastrophic law. The law stated, "The condition of the child shall follow the condition of the mother, partus sequitur ventrum." That is, if a female slave gave birth, the child would be born a slave. This single law permanently sealed the fate of African Americans. Slavery was no longer a temporary job. It became a curse carried down from one generation to the next. The law did not stop there. The notorious slave codes were created. These codes stripped enslaved people of their humanity. They were forbidden from learning to read or write, as knowledge represented the idea of freedom. They were forbidden from gathering in groups or traveling without the owner's permission. Their right to testify against a white person in court was revoked. Above all, they were defined as property, chattel. Just as a bed or a cow could be bought and sold, so too could a human being. In this way, alongside the ideals of liberty and democracy in the New World, a rigid caste society was born, where the color of one's skin determined the value of one's life. 3. The reign of cotton and the Second Middle Passage. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the American South was primarily an agricultural land. But the situation changed drastically with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. This machine made cotton processing incredibly easy. Cotton cultivation became immensely profitable. A smile appeared on the faces of the southern plantation owners, but the cause of that smile was the blood and tears of the enslaved. The increase in cotton production required even more laborers. The human market. This demand led to the beginning of the second Middle Passage, the internal slave trade within America, after the importation from Africa was banned. Older slave states like Virginia and Maryland turned into breeding centers for slaves. Families were mercilessly broken up. A father on one plantation, a mother in another state, and the child sold off to distant Louisiana or Mississippi. Children were separated from their mothers and sold on the auction block. This was the most heartbreaking and regular scene of slavery. Life on the plantations was one of extreme exploitation. From sunrise to sunset, field hands worked under the threat of the whip in unbearable heat. Their living quarters were dilapidated shacks, and food was meager. Any perceived disobedience to the owner or the overseer resulted in brutal punishment. This plantation economy was a monster that generated billions of dollars in American wealth, with every single dollar earned resting on the backbreaking labor of an enslaved person.
Or constitutional ambivalence, the wound in the nation's heart. When the U.S. Constitution was being drafted in 1787, slavery was an impossible issue to ignore. Amidst the South's stubborn insistence on maintaining slavery and the North's faint whispers of abolition, a dangerous compromise was born. The Three-Fifths Compromise. This agreement stipulated that for the purposes of population count, for representation and taxation, an enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. This did not give the enslaved any rights. Rather, it exponentially increased the political power of the slave owners. A slave was not a full person, but provided the owner with full political advantage. Thus, slavery was legalized within the very framework of the Constitution. This political agreement divided the nation's destiny into two halves, the North and the South, which, although ostensibly united, were morally and economically polar opposites. The dark stain of this constitutional compromise planted the seeds of the Civil War. 5. Seeds of resistance and Northern complicity. Even amidst this extreme exploitation, the seeds of resistance sprouted. This was done through overt rebellions, which often failed and led to brutal punishment, or through silent acts like slowing down work, breaking tools, or running away. The family and religion of the enslaved were the main foundations of their resistance. Secretly, they merged their African traditions with the new Christian faith to create spirituals, songs where they prayed for freedom and hid code words for escape. On the other hand, the North was a silent partner in this chain. Banks in New York and Boston financed the southern plantations. Northern ships transported the cotton. The Northern economy was indirectly dependent on the slave labor of the South. Although slavery began to be abolished in some northern states, racial discrimination against African Americans was also widespread there.
The fire of resistance and the breaking of the nation's spine. The narrative begins. In Part 1, we saw how the chains of slavery became entrenched in the soil of America. But the human mind cannot be bound by chains. Wherever there is injustice, resistance is born. Part 2 is the story of the indomitable people who dared to tear down the structure of slavery, not just with their hands, but with their minds. It is the story of rebellion, the subterranean path to freedom, and a political debate that ultimately tore the entire nation in two. 1. The secret resistance of the enslaved, the silent war. Enslaved people never accepted their fate silently. While open-armed rebellion was rare, resistance in daily life was commonplace. This resistance was a silent war against the morality and functionality of slavery. A. Daily acts of disobedience. The most common form of resistance was slowing down work. Enslaved individuals would deliberately work slowly, damage tools, or make mistakes during the harvest. Although owners enforced strict punishments, this small-scale sabotage helped reduce the productivity of the plantations. Alongside this was the pursuit of knowledge. Learning to read or write was strictly forbidden by the slave codes, but many secretly acquired literacy. This knowledge brought them the light of freedom. Reading the Bible or secretly writing letters were powerful forms of resistance. B. The Call for Armed Rebellion, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. Armed rebellion was the most dangerous form of resistance. Although most rebellions were brutally suppressed, they instilled a permanent fear in the minds of the Southern slave owners. Denmark Vesey, 1822. In Charleston, South Carolina, Vesey, a free black man, planned a massive rebellion. The plan was exposed, and Vesey, along with 35 others, were hanged. This incident forced the Southern states to create even stricter slave codes. Nat Turner, 1831. Turner was a deeply religious enslaved man in Virginia. He led a revolt that resulted in the killing of approximately 60 white people in 2 days. This rebellion was the bloodiest slave revolt in the South. While Turner and his followers were executed, hundreds of innocent enslaved people were subsequently massacred in retaliation. This event created extreme terror among slave owners in the South and permanently destroyed their sense of security. C. Running away, risking everything for freedom. The most symbolic form of resistance was escape. This flight was a life-or-death gamble for freedom. 2. The Underground Railroad, the secret network of liberation. A secret network was formed to help fugitive slaves, known in history as the Underground Railroad. This was not an actual railway, but a massive web of secure routes, secret safe houses, stations, and helpers, conductors, to reach free states like the North or Canada. Harriet Tubman. The most legendary conductor of this network was Harriet Tubman, herself a formerly enslaved person. She returned to the South approximately 19 times and successfully freed hundreds of enslaved people. Tubman was called the Moses of her people because she never lost a passenger. The helpers. Both white and black individuals were involved in this network, risking extreme danger to provide food, shelter, and secret instructions to the escaping slaves. This work was a moral war against state law. The Underground Railroad shook the moral foundation of slavery and proved how much risk people were willing to take to achieve freedom. 3. The Abolitionist Movement, the Awakening of Voices. In the first half of the 19th century, a powerful movement for the abolition of slavery began in the northern states. It was an intense effort to awaken the moral conscience of American society. A. Garrison and the Liberator. One of the main leaders was the white journalist William Lloyd Garrison. In 1831, he began publishing his influential newspaper, The Liberator. Garrison believed that slavery was a moral sin and should be abolished immediately without any compromise. He viewed the Constitution as a covenant with death because it legalized slavery. B. Douglass, the living witness to slavery. The most powerful voice in the movement was Frederick Douglass, himself a runaway slave. Douglass was an exceptional orator and writer. His autobiography directly highlighted the brutality of slavery and its human cost. Douglass proved that black people were not only human, but intellectually and morally equal to white people. C. Gender and the movement. Women also played a crucial role. White women like Angelina and Sarah Grimke began speaking out, and black women like Sojourner Truth fought against both slavery and gender oppression. 4. Political debate and failed compromises. As time passed, slavery intensified the division between the North and the South. The U.S. government attempted several compromises to prevent the nation from dissolving. A. The Missouri Compromise, 1820. This agreement temporarily maintained the balance by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. It also banned slavery in new territories above the 36 degrees 30 north latitude. This postponed the conflict but did not solve the problem. B. The Compromise of 1850. This compromise included the controversial Fugitive Slave Act. This law compelled Northern citizens and states to assist in returning runaway slaves, forcing the North to be directly complicit in the institution of slavery and generating widespread Northern resentment. C. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise and introduced popular sovereignty, allowing the residents of the Kansas and Nebraska territories to vote on whether to allow slavery. This led to violence erupting in Kansas known as Bleeding Kansas, which served as a small-scale rehearsal for the Civil War. 5. Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a devastating ruling. No person of African descent could ever be a citizen of the U.S., thus having no right to file suit. Slaves were property. Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory. This ruling invalidated nearly all previous compromises and made Northerners fear that slavery was now constitutionally at risk of spreading nationwide. This decision destroyed the last bridge of trust and compromise between the North and South. 6. John Brown's Raid, 1859. The anti-slavery extremist John Brown attacked the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, intending to arm the enslaved and launch a massive rebellion. Brown's raid failed and he was hanged. To the North, many saw Brown as a martyr in the moral fight against slavery. To the South, Brown's attack was viewed as a direct terrorist assault by the North on their way of life and security. The John Brown incident proved that the problem of slavery was no longer a matter of political or legal debate. It had reached the stage of bloody conflict. The nation now stood at the brink of war.
The nation's ultimate conflict and the breaking of the chains. The narrative begins. In Part 2, we saw how all paths of compromise between the North and South over slavery had closed. The election of 1860 became the symbolic moment of that final conflict. The nation that was born with the Declaration of Independence in its hand was now forced to ask itself, freedom for whom? Only for whites or for all? Part 3 is that bloody answer, the story of the American Civil War. 1. Secession. The nation splits. When the issue of slavery reached its boiling point, the Southern states decided to secede from the Union. For them, slavery was a question of their way of life and economic sovereignty. A. The election of Abraham Lincoln. The 1860 presidential election was the catalyst for this division. Abraham Lincoln was elected as the Republican candidate. Republicans did not advocate for the abolition of slavery where it already existed, but they opposed its expansion into new territories. The South viewed this as a threat, an indication that the central government intended to abolish their slave system in the future. Immediately following the election, the Southern states rapidly began to leave the Union. South Carolina's leadership. In December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. The Confederate States of America, CSA. By February 1861, 7 Southern states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, united to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America, led by President Jefferson Davis. They constitutionally secured slavery within their new government. B. The start of the war, Fort Sumter. In April 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union fort located in Charleston, South Carolina. This was the first shot of the Civil War. This event forced the North to enter the conflict. Following this, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, left the Union and joined the Confederacy. The nation was formally divided, North, Union, versus South, Confederacy. 2. The war's purpose, slavery and liberty. The Civil War did not initially begin with the goal of abolishing slavery. Lincoln's primary objective was to save the Union and prevent division. But the brutality of the war and strategic necessities quickly changed the war's purpose. A. Military necessity. Lincoln and the Union generals soon realized that the Confederacy's military strength was heavily dependent on its slave labor. Enslaved people worked on the plantations, which allowed white Confederate men to join the war effort. Attacking slavery meant breaking the backbone of the Confederacy's economy. B. Public demand. Abolitionists in the North and the black community demanded from the start that this war must be a war to end slavery. Frederick Douglass strongly pressured Lincoln to allow black men to join the Union forces and fight for their freedom. 3. The Proclamation of Freedom, the Emancipation Proclamation. In this changing environment of the war, Lincoln made a historic decision that altered the course of history: the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued this proclamation. It was a strategic and moral step. Effective freedom. It immediately declared the freedom of enslaved people, about 3.1 million, in the Confederate-controlled states. Limitation. It did not affect slavery in the border states, which remained with the Union but had slavery, such as Kentucky and Maryland. It was a wartime measure, not a direct law. Military goal. The main goal of the proclamation was to weaken the Confederacy's ability to wage war. It encouraged the enslaved to flee the plantations and seek refuge within Union lines. The thunder of emancipation. The proclamation turned the Civil War into a moral battle. Now the Union was fighting not just to save the country, but also for freedom itself. 4. Black soldiers, the Union fighters. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, black men were permitted to join the Union forces. This was their most powerful action against slavery and racism. U.S. colored troops. Approximately 180,000 black men joined the Union Army as the U.S. Colored Troops, USCT. Many of them were fugitive slaves. Exceptional courage. Black soldiers fought despite facing severe discrimination, lower pay, and the risk of execution if captured by the Confederates. Units like the 54th Massachusetts Regiment demonstrated extraordinary bravery, which helped increase the respect for black people among white Northerners. These black soldiers proved that they were not only worthy of freedom, but were ready to die for it. Their participation played a vital role in the Union's victory. 5. The reality of war, destruction and tragedy. The Civil War was the most destructive conflict on American soil. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died in this war, more than the total number of soldiers killed in all other American wars combined. Andersonville. Confederate prisoner of war camps were symbols of extreme inhumanity. Thousands of Union soldiers died in Andersonville due to extreme hunger and disease. Sherman's March to the Sea. Union General William T. Sherman led a devastating campaign across Georgia. His goal was to break the South's economy and morale. This total war strategy wrought widespread destruction on Southern plantations and railroads. This campaign also paved the way for the enslaved's freedom, as Sherman's troops broke their chains. 6. Victory and the last words of freedom. In April 1885, the Confederates' main general, Robert E. Lee, surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The Civil War ended and the Union was preserved. Just months before the war ended, Lincoln declared in his second inaugural address, "This terrible war was the woe due to 250 years of unrequited toil." He called for healing the nation's wounds and establishing peace. But the victory was short-lived for Lincoln. In April 1885, John Wilkes Booth assassinated him. Even without Lincoln, his primary goals were achieved: the preservation of the Union and the certainty of slavery's end. The final constitutional change. Following the war, a constitutional guarantee was needed to completely abolish slavery. The 13th Amendment. This amendment was ratified in December 1865.
It formally declared that slavery or involuntary servitude shall no longer exist in the U.S. This amendment was the final culmination in the history of slavery. Millions of people who had been bound by chains for generations were now legally free. But did freedom mean the end of all their problems?
The Unfinished Revolution and the Shadow of Jim Crow. The narrative begins. The Civil War ended with the breaking of the chains, but freedom was only the beginning of a brutal new struggle. Part 4 tells the story of Reconstruction, a hopeful but ultimately failed attempt to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million newly freed people into American society. It is the story of a revolution left unfinished, and how the defeated ideology of white supremacy adapted, evolving from slavery into a systemic, legal framework of racial control that would define the next century of American life. 1. The Dawn of Freedom and the Challenges of Peace, 1865 to 1867. The ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 officially ended slavery, but it left fundamental questions unanswered. What did freedom truly mean for the freedmen, and who would decide the future of the defeated South? A. The Freedmen's Bureau. To aid the transition from slavery to freedom, the U.S. government established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. This agency provided vital assistance, including food and medical care, providing immediate relief to former slaves and impoverished whites; education, establishing thousands of schools across the South, marking the first time mass education was available to Black Americans; legal aid, helping the newly freed navigate contracts and disputes with former owners. The Bureau was a lifeline, but it was underfunded, short-staffed, and faced fierce resistance from white Southerners. B. The quest for land and economic freedom. For the formerly enslaved, true freedom required economic independence. Many believed that the government owed them 40 acres and a mule as compensation for generations of unpaid labor. Reversed order. General William T. Sherman had issued an order temporarily granting land to Black families. However, President Andrew Johnson soon reversed this, returning the land to its former Confederate owners. Sharecropping. With no land of their own, most Black families were forced into sharecropping and tenant farming. They worked the land owned by their former masters, paying rent with a large share of the crop. This system created a cycle of debt and dependency that was often just one step removed from slavery. 2. Radical Reconstruction and Constitutional Change, 1867 to 1877. President Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies quickly allowed former Confederates to regain political power. In response, the radical Republicans in Congress seized control of the process, viewing the South as conquered territory that needed fundamental restructuring to protect the rights of Black citizens. A. The Reconstruction Amendments. To legally establish a new foundation for liberty and equality, the radical Republicans passed 3 monumental constitutional amendments. 14th Amendment, 1868. This defined citizenship, including former slaves, and guaranteed equal protection under the law and due process to all citizens. This was a direct reversal of the Dred Scott decision. 15th Amendment, 1870. This guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. B. Black political participation. During this period, Black men voted and held political office for the first time in American history. Thousands served in state legislatures, and over a dozen served in the U.S. Congress, including Hiram Revels, the first African-American U.S. Senator. This era saw the establishment of public schools, social welfare programs, and economic development, a genuine, albeit brief, experiment in interracial democracy. C. White Terror and the KKK. This progress was met with violent resistance from white Southerners who refused to accept racial equality. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, were founded to terrorize and intimidate black voters and their white Republican allies. They used tactics of midnight rides, murder, rape, and property destruction to restore white control. The KKK's terrorism effectively undermined the political progress of Reconstruction. 3. The end of Reconstruction and the Great Betrayal, 1877. The North grew weary of the ongoing conflict and the cost of maintaining troops in the South to enforce civil rights. A. The Compromise of 1877. The disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was resolved through a backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877. The deal: Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as president. In return, the Republicans agreed to immediately withdraw all remaining federal troops from the South. This withdrawal signaled the end of Reconstruction. Without federal protection, the governments established by the radical Republicans and black voters quickly collapsed under the weight of white conservative Democrats, who were now free to restore white supremacy. This moment is often called the Great Betrayal. 4. The rise of Jim Crow, systemic apartheid. After 1877, the South systematically dismantled the political and social gains of Reconstruction, replacing them with a strict legal system of racial segregation and discrimination known as Jim Crow. A. Disenfranchisement. White Democrats used legal mechanisms to prevent black men from voting, circumventing the 15th Amendment. Poll taxes, requiring a fee to vote, which disproportionately affected poor black farmers. Literacy tests, requiring voters to read and interpret complex legal documents, often administered unfairly to fail black applicants. Grandfather clauses, exempting white voters whose grandfathers had voted before the Civil War, while still subjecting black voters to the poll taxes and literacy tests. B. Segregation and Plessy versus Ferguson. Segregation became the law of the land, affecting every aspect of public life: schools, transportation, restrooms, restaurants, and hospitals.
Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional under the doctrine of separate but equal. In reality, black facilities were always inferior, establishing a legal apartheid that would last for over half a century. C. Lynching and terror. Economic and political repression was backed by extra-legal violence. Lynching, the public murder of black individuals by white mobs, became a prevalent form of racial terror, often carried out without legal consequence. These acts served to enforce Jim Crow laws and crush any attempts at resistance or economic progress. 5. The enduring legacy of slavery. By the turn of the 20th century, the South had achieved what it fought for in the Civil War: the subjugation of the black population, albeit through legal and economic means rather than chattel slavery. The legacy of slavery became deeply embedded in the national consciousness. Economic disparity. Generations of forced labor, lack of land ownership, and discriminatory economic practices created a massive wealth gap between white and black Americans that persists today. Institutional racism. The legal structures of Jim Crow and the political disenfranchisement ensured that racism was not just a matter of individual prejudice, but a feature of the American system itself. Cultural influence. The art, music, blues, jazz, spirituals, and literature born out of the black experience, shaped first by slavery and then by Jim Crow, profoundly influenced global culture.